Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Transition to Future Net Zero Buildings webinar, organized by the British Consulate General Hong Kong and Business Environment Council, BC. I'm Wayne from BC's Policy and Research team, and I'll be your MC for today. For a few housekeeping rules, today's seminar will be recorded and uploaded to our website and YouTube channel, so please feel free to revisit the content in the future. Participants are all muted by default, and if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A function, and we will address them at the panel discussion. To kickstart the webinar, may I please invite the CEO of BC, Mr. Adam Khoo, to give us his opening remarks. Adam, please.
Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to this webinar on the Transitioning to Future Net Zero Buildings. This event is co-organized by the Business Environment Council and the British Consulate General Hong Kong. It is our great pleasure to collaborate with the British Consulate General again in the build-up towards COP26, hosted by the United Kingdom in Glasgow, starting October 31st. Climate change continues to be top of global agenda in 2021. We had witnessed high-profile events held on this subject, such as the Leaders' Summit on Climate in April, with heads of state and politicians reaffirming the need for unprecedented global ambition and togetherness to overcome climate change. As recent as last week, the Climate Week was held in New York, with focuses on fulfilling and increasing commitments made by governments, businesses, and other organizations, as well as on doing more, faster. These events have set the tone ahead of COP26. Meanwhile, extreme weather incidents continue to take place around the world this year. Heavy rains, intense storms, deadly floods, ferocious wildfires, and searing heat waves reminded us repeatedly that our planet is in a state of climate emergency. In August, the first part of the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published as another reality check. The report predicts global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels under all 5 emission scenarios considered. It also stated that global warming could possibly be controlled within 2 degrees during this century only if we accelerate and deepen carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emission reductions in the immediate decades ahead. In short, we are in a race against time to net zero carbon emissions by mid-century or sooner. Here in Hong Kong, building activities account for more than 90% of electricity consumption and 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. It is widely acknowledged that decarbonising buildings and the built environment are crucial to achieving Hong Kong's carbon neutral target by 2050. Today, we'll hear from international speakers on the latest developments and initiatives in transitioning to net zero buildings in the UK and other regions. Also, local experts and practitioners will join a panel discussion to share experience regarding full sector and stakeholder collaboration on green buildings in Hong Kong. As we count down to COP26, our speakers today will surely inspire conversation that will lead to transformative changes and accelerated actions in the building sector. So I hope you will enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Today, we're very privileged to have 3 speakers from the UK and Geneva to share with us their insights, and they'll be joined by 2 more building experts in Hong Kong at the panel discussion. So without further ado, please welcome Ms. Phoebe Lewis, Senior Consultant at JLL, to share her experience on decarbonisation priorities for the built environment. Phoebe, please, you can share your screen and turn on your camera.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. And so thank you as well to Mr. Khoo for the opening remarks. What I'm going to be talking about briefly this morning are the decarbonisation priorities for the built environment. And so building on what was just said, just taking a step back as a reminder as to why 2021 is such an important year for climate change and for net zero carbon in the built environment. As Mr. Khoo said, this is the year of COP26, so the latest round of the international climate change negotiations that are taking place here in the UK at the end of the year. Now, we have COPs, International Climate Talks, every year, but this one, COP26, is particularly important. It's the most important COP since COP21, which was where the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And the Paris Climate Agreement basically asked that we keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the reason why this COP at the end of the year is so significant is that it's the first opportunity for countries to raise their ambition on the commitments that they made in Paris, because basically the commitments that were made to accompany the Paris Climate Agreement were not sufficiently ambitious to meet that target. And so this year in Glasgow, it's the first opportunity that countries are going to have to show how they've improved their level of ambition to meet that target. And in the lead up to that, the private sector is trying to push leadership amongst countries through what's called the Race to Zero. This is a UN-backed global campaign to try and get as many companies signed up to net zero carbon by COP26 as possible. So that's the global scale of ambition. But what does it mean for the built environment? So in the built environment, we've had some of the numbers for what is relevant to particular parts of the world this morning. However, globally, the built environment is a significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. Most estimates put it around 39% of global emissions coming from the built environment. And now that covers a range of things. Historically, we focus mostly on what's called operational emissions, so emissions that come from the running of buildings. But actually, while those are very important, a large part of emissions from the built environment come from construction. They come from the materials that are used for the construction of buildings and that are embodied throughout the process of that building's lifetime. And this is something that is often overlooked, but is very, very important, especially for regions, for cities that are developing at a huge pace. So when we talk about emissions for the built environment, we're talking about both those things. How can we reduce the emissions that are required to operate our built spaces, but also how can we reduce the emissions associated with the materials that we use to construct the spaces around us? So it's thinking holistically about these that is very important for the built environment. So then that brings us on to another question, which is, so we've got these emissions from operational carbon and from embodied carbon, but how do we decarbonize? How do we reach net zero carbon? And so as part of that, a question that's often asked, and one which there needs to be improved clarity on, is what actually is net zero carbon? What does it mean to completely decarbonize those parts of our industry? And so what you see in front of you is a visual representation of that journey to achieve net zero carbon. So it begins with understanding your carbon baseline. And this might seem an obvious thing to do, but actually one of the challenges that we often come across when we interact with companies is that they want to focus on something that might actually not be a big contributor to their greenhouse gas emissions. So when I talk to certain companies, they'll say, well, we want to decarbonize our headquarters office, or we want to decarbonize our waste production. And by undertaking a carbon baselining exercise, you can actually tell as a company that those are not really major sources of emissions. They might be important in their own right, but they're not a big part of the net zero carbon story. So understanding where your major sources of emissions are is the main first step. Then going on to reduce that embodied carbon, so the carbon that's associated with construction. And this can be done through circular economy principles. So it can be through selecting recycled concrete that comes locally rather than from far overseas, looking at wood as an alternative structure, all these different options that allow you to reduce your embodied carbon. And then you can go on to the operational use. So increasing your energy efficiency, both in the way that building is designed, but then also in the way that building is operated. And then once you've maximized the energy efficiency to the extent possible, ensuring that the remaining energy that is required for that building comes from a renewable source. Ideally, that would come from on-site. If you could put solar PV panels on the building, that would be wonderful. But realistically, that might not work for a lot of buildings and for a lot of companies. And so the next step is then to figure out, is it possible to procure renewable energy from the local grid? And so if it is, pursuing that route is the next step in that sequence towards net zero carbon. But for many countries, there isn't necessarily renewable energy supply at the right scale to the grid. And so there are large policy considerations that need to come around that. But in the interim, it's possible for companies to explore international renewable energy certificates. So purchasing that renewable energy in another site with the idea that it would then offset the energy that you're using from a non-renewable source. And then the last stage in that process to net zero is to understand that even if we try to reduce to the extent possible, it still means that you're at the end of all these steps, you might still have some emissions that you're not able to get rid of in the operation of your building or in the construction of it. And so at that point, then it's fine to use carbon offsets, so long as they come from a high quality source. So it's really understanding the offsets at the moment still do have a role in the journey towards net zero carbon, but they really should be seen as a last resort once all the other options have been pursued. And so for the companies and the countries who are leading in their steps and in their journey towards net zero carbon, these are the key principles which they're seeking to draw out. So with that in mind, what is actually happening around net zero carbon at the moment? We have the priorities for decarbonising, which is looking at the operations and looking at the embodied carbon, but then what is actually happening this year? So as I mentioned at the start, one of the major activities that is happening around net zero carbon is through the Race to Zero. So it is this UN-backed global campaign, which is galvanizing leadership from non-state actors to basically set net zero carbon commitments. So there are a number of companies across the built environment and outside of the built environment who are signing up and saying that they are going to achieve net zero carbon by the year 2050 at the latest. And so that's the priority this year. It's getting as many companies as possible to sign up and say that this is their ambition. This is something that they are going to commit to. And then once they've done that, the priority for next year is developing that roadmap to be able to deliver against that. So it's setting that carbon baseline and it's exploring those steps in a manner that is appropriate for each company. So that's the priority for this year. And to just give you a flavor of some of the companies that have already joined the Race to Zero. So JLL, where I work, has joined the Race to Zero through the Climate Pledge Initiative. On screen, you can see some companies that have also joined the Race to Zero, but there really are a huge number, and this is across architects, across construction, across real estate, investment and ownership. And so it really covers a whole swathe of the entire spectrum of the built environment. And that's also what we're trying to do with the Race to Zero is reflect the nuances of the different parts of the built environment. So there are some avenues that are going to be more appropriate for architects, some that are more appropriate for real estate investment companies. And the Race to Zero allows for that spectrum in approaching this issue. It just sets that common denominator of let's try and do this by 2050 at the very latest. And in practice, a lot of companies are setting their ambitions well in advance of that year because there's a recognition that 2050 is probably too late. And so we're seeing progress here, and we're seeing progress through these and many other companies. And so as a very last point, that is one of the main asks that we are trying to put forward as part of the built environment community, which is, can we get as many companies as possible signing up to the Race to Zero and making commitments to understand their emissions, to decarbonize and to decarbonize in alignment with these global commitments, with these global standards. So that's a brief overview from my side in the decarbonisation priorities for the built environment and some of the progress and actions that have been made in the past year. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Phoebe, for putting the importance of decarbonizing the built environment into context. We will now shift our focus to how we can achieve a net zero built environment before 2050. Mr. Luca Di Giovanetti, Manager, Science-based targets from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD, will share his insights. Luca, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Voila, I can start my video. Good afternoon, everyone. Sharing my screen. Does it work well? Yeah, perfect. So good afternoon, my name is Luca De Giovanetti. I work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we are the global. So we represent the global business. So we are we have over 200 global companies part of our organization, and also we have regional and local networks such as the BEC. So as part of our members, I mean, maybe good to mention as well, we have some UK, Hong Kong representatives such as Swire, New World Development, Jardine Matheson, and CLP. So what we are doing, I mean, I would like to share with you the information about the built environment. And maybe, yeah, as Phoebe mentioned, I think the importance and the numbers of the built environment is crucial to highlight. I mean, 40% of the global carbon emission, that's a lot. And being 40% means also 40% of the solution. So what I find always astonishing is from Hong Kong, as Mr. Koo mentioned, is that actually in Hong Kong, this number is much higher. So 60% of the carbon emission and also 90% of the electricity consumption in buildings. So definitely to achieve our 1.5 target, we have to address it in the built environment. So the goal as well is to halve emission by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. So, and with intermediary step from embodied carbon, but also operational carbon. So from WBCSD side, what we want to do is really to accelerate the achievement of a net zero emission across the entire built environment life cycle. So really looking at the full life cycle of it. And the crucial aspect is really the system-wide collaboration. We cannot achieve that alone. So I will share more information about what we're doing, but I also was asked as well to give an overview on the science-based target. And I think that to tell the story of science-based target, we need to start about what does it want to achieve and what is the problem. So the main objective is that we have a limited amount of carbon that we can still emit in the atmosphere before we overshoot the 1.5 and also the 2-degree target. So, and also the more we delay the action, the steeper is the decarbonization, expected decarbonization to meet that target. So that's why it's also important that we act now and as much and as fast as possible. So the science-based target is this initiative led by 4 NGOs in the space, and the idea is really to ensure that there is a reporting and validation of climate targets from companies. So this transparent reporting and validation if climate targets from companies is indeed in line with what is required to decarbonize to achieve the global target. So there is obviously different pathways, and I'm not going to go much in detail, but there is obviously a kind of pathway to decarbonize based on the sector that company are. For the built environment, there is obviously, depending on the material side, there is maybe some cement and steel, they have some sectoral approaches, but also there is also the otherwise kind of a general decarbonization. And then depending on the target, climate target, the temperature target, there is a percentage decrease that is required to be achieved to be in line with that target. So what is science-based target also doing now, and this is kind of music for now and near future, is they are also developing together in adapting the current science-based target, which is more a near-term target, really looking at the 5 to 10, 15 years horizon, and also the long-term net zero target, which is what does it mean to achieve the deep decarbonization, really almost reaching zero emission, and then the remaining part of, if needed, kind of what are the removal aspect to really achieve the net zero. So these are the company commitments that company are suggested to achieve to reach net zero. What is also important is that together with company commitments, there is also the buildings aspect to achieve net zero. So how do we align the company boundaries with building boundaries so that we achieve the 40% of global emission, we tackle the 40% of global emission and reduce that. So within our WBCSD, what we have been looking, it's really at what is the system and who plays a role in the system. So as you can see, there is the built environment, kind of where carbon is emitted in buildings. So during the manufacturing, the embodied carbon, construction, the use of buildings, the end of life. But there is also a lot of different players that are not directly emitting carbon, but they have a huge influence on if and how buildings are constructed. And this is also, all this plays an important role to make sure that we tackle the reduction in buildings. So what we have done to kind of try to align this narrative between company and buildings, really to tackle the system perspective, we have to understand where carbon is in buildings. And therefore, we have developed the building system carbon framework, which kind of shows where in the building and when in the life cycle of the building carbon is emitted. So in this way, we can map how much is, where the carbon is emitted. So this is a transparently way to report and show where emissions happen. And this is, we have developed recently a publication with Arup on net zero building, on where do we stand. It was a mapping of 6 case study for a detailed carbon footprint using the framework on reporting what are the numbers that we are looking at on the embodied carbon, the operational carbon, the embodied carbon during the life cycle of a building, so the renovation phase and so. And so really to kind of provide a transparent information of where carbon are emitted. And this is very important to then understand what can we do to decarbonize? What are the next steps then that we can do to get from this number down? So where do we stand now and how can we reduce that? So in fact, the next step now after this is really, what can we do now? What can we tackle? So the key message from the report, I think, which I want to emphasize as well, is really kind of the importance of our all life carbon thinking and reporting. So we need to create more evidence of what does it mean, all life carbon emission in building. So when we understand where carbon is emitted, then we can understand what can we do to decarbonize. We also need to have more data, more transparency, more reporting. So it was a very challenging work to get this level of detail in the project, simply because there is still challenges in collecting data, reporting data, sharing data. We need to be more transparent in that, and we need to do it more often so that it becomes more known, and then it's easier to understand what can we do. In targets as well, we need to set explicit target on carbon emission in buildings. Ideally, we should have like a fixed target of carbon emission for square kilogram of CO2 per square meter on embodied carbon, on operational carbon, on all life carbon, so that really, once we have a fixed target, then it's easy to understand how low we can go. What can the trajectory be to decarbonize the building sector? Net zero, the definition of net zero, and especially for net zero building, it's really important that it's in line with the coming narrative that, for example, Science-Based Target Initiative, together with a lot of experts, is developing. What does it mean? What is allowed and what can be included or not, especially from the removal, offset, compensation aspect for the definition of net zero. So what is valid for company would apply also for buildings, so that we have a common understanding of the challenge. And the system collaboration, this is, I think, is crucial. And as I say, system really means the whole system, but also then, of course, policy, science, finance, everybody needs to collaborate. So in that, so I think there is a discussion as well after on what can we do on the decarbonization. So I wanted also to share this publication we recently launched as well on practical recommendation for investor and development on how to reduce embodied carbon. I think Toby mentioned about the importance of tackling embodied carbons. This has been probably more neglected so far. This is where we need to go next. So, and this is practical recommendation for different levels of understanding what can we go, how can we do to reduce. Then yeah, so I think we're all looking forward to the COP, or at least hopefully that will be a successful COP. But yeah, the voice of the built environment with the race to zero, race to resilience, but all the different parties that are involved in highlighting the importance of the built environment at the COP is really increasing the momentum, and I really hope that we can bring this importance of the sector to the COP. And maybe the last one I want to share with you is about the WBCSD current update of the Vision 2050, which is really the business vision to tackle sustainability. And there is one specific pathway for living spaces. We really address the issue of what business need to do to drive sustainability in the built environment. With that all, thank you very much. Thank you for having the opportunity to share the insights. So,
thank you, Luca, for giving us a very comprehensive overview on science-based targets, as well as frameworks for decarbonizing the building's value chain. Our next speaker is Mr. Andy Mace, Director at Arup, who will give us a presentation on planning the energy transition for the building sector. Andy, please, you can share your screen.
Morning from the UK, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Let me share my screen. I have some slides to share. Hopefully they're, are they showing?
Yeah, we see it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect, great. So let me get underway. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to touch briefly on some of the broad policy and strategy drivers for the for net zero in the UK, followed by some of the work within Arup. So myself and many of my colleagues have been doing at the macro scale to help governments and local authorities in the UK plan for decarbonising the building sector. So starting with a bit of very high level context for the UK. This is very high level. So the UK has a national net zero target by 2050. It's a target set in law in the UK. And as we head rapidly to COP26, the UK has recently increased its nationally determined contribution to a 68% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. There's no question that having a national target is absolutely key, but nevertheless, there is still so much to do across all sectors of the UK to then get the policies and the strategies in place, of course, together with the action that we really need. And that's such an important aspect of COP this year, is to drive national action, to drive the changes we need at scale and at the speed that we need to be going at. And yeah, the policy and strategy context in the UK is changing very rapidly, and is difficult to at times to keep up with. From my own experience of working in the north of the UK, and particularly in Scotland over the last few years, what's been really useful is that I've seen an integrated systems-based energy strategy for Scotland really for the first time, and that is really driving energy changes across all the sectors, and particularly for energy efficiency improvements in buildings. And that has then led to a program of work that is currently being undertaken again at a national scale to plan towards achieving those important net zero targets on a national scale. I can't say I've seen the same fully integrated approach across the whole of the UK. There are pockets of it. But later this year, in fact, next month, we're expecting the UK government's net zero strategy to be published, which hopefully will bring some rigor to other cross-sector targets, in action across the UK. We have in the UK an organisation called the Climate Change Committee. It's a national committee that provides climate advice to the UK government on decarbonisation and climate resilience. And they are also the organisation that sets the national carbon budget that the government then adopts and puts into law. In 2019, the committee set out its vision, a potential pathway to get to net zero in the UK, and that was the report that led the UK government to switch from an 80 to 100% net zero target by 2050. Now, as I said, we expect the UK National Net Zero Strategy to be published very soon, but this very simple diagram gives an overview of the committee's pathway, so the work that they did to suggest a pathway for the UK to get to net zero, and it gives a really good idea of the kind of the scale and the breadth of the the changes that are needed. It is a really simple overview. It belies such huge complexity. I absolutely get this, but it sort of shows the integrated sector by sector pathway to net zero. As I said, it's not the UK's national strategy, but it provides an option. And fundamentally, the committee is suggesting a national approach that for buildings particularly, and focusing on the buildings element of this. So huge national programs of resource and energy efficiency to reduce energy demand across the economy and across the built environment, extensive electrification, particularly of heat. We are a nation that is heating led, so electrifying that heat to move away from the reliance on fossil fuels. And this involves the doubling of electricity generation with that new generation coming from zero carbon sources, and moving to a hydrogen economy. And this is a massive debate in the UK at the moment around production and use of hydrogen. But the Committee on Climate Change proposals are that it is used for many industrial processes, for electrical generation and for heating in peak periods in buildings, as well as in other uses in other sectors that are hard to decarbonise. The speed we need to move at, including decarbonisation of buildings, and the previous speakers have hinted at that, is extremely challenging. The Tyndall Research Centre in the UK has produced some really good work on carbon budgets for the UK's cities and local authorities. They took the Paris Agreement and they've translated that into carbon budgets, translating the well below 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5 degrees global temperature target and equity principles in the Paris Agreement, and disaggregating that down to a national UK carbon budget, and then splitting that across subnational areas. So taking the fact that COP is in Glasgow this year, of course, I've looked at Glasgow's carbon budget, just the simple graph here on the slide. And that very, very frighteningly is saying that if Glasgow continues to emit greenhouse gas emissions at the level it was in 2017, then Glasgow would use its entire carbon budget by 2027. And looking across all of the cities and local authorities of areas of the UK, this is typical. That's sort of using our budgets up by 2027 is this typical time frame if we are to stay within and not overshoot the theoretical share of the UK's carbon budget under the Paris Agreement. So, those kind of figures, those kind of time spans really bring focus to the speed, as I said, and the scale of what we need to do. Now, I am absolutely a glass is half full person. I'm very optimistic about our ability globally to make the changes we need. And for the next few slides, I'm going to run through some of the work we've been doing, particularly in the UK, to help with that decarbonisation of the building sector. So I realise it's an obvious thing to say. We cannot decarbonise one building at a time in isolation. In the UK alone, we have something like 29 million homes in the domestic sector that need some form of energy efficiency retrofit, and we are not going to do those one at a time. It needs whole systems, national programs of retrofit and change. At Arup, we try to capture this whole energy system and the changes that are required across generation, the supply networks and demand efficiency that are required, and that are actually happening. And we've sort of tried to capture that in this very simple infographic of what the UK's energy system may look like in 2050 after the transition that is happening and is needed. At building scale, there's a lot happening across the UK around energy efficiency retrofits across all building sectors, setting standards, developing programs of retrofit, and looking at new ways of financing them. The slide here is a niche project in the north of England where Arup is helping Northern Gas Networks, one of the big gas energy companies, to design and construct 9 houses that reflect house types from 1900 to the year 2000. And this is creating a national housing retrofit research centre. And it should be built in the next year. The homes will reflect and will be built as closely as possible to homes of that period. And then this will support a research programme that will look at impacts, as I said in the slide, from insulation, windows, heating systems, electrification, using heat pumps, introducing hydrogen into homes, and then looking at the comfort, the human factors, what are the economics, what's affordable, what does it mean for energy costs, etc. And we really hope that the research from this will inform sort of other national programs of retrofit. One of the other key approaches developing rapidly in the UK that I want to focus on in the next few slides is this concept of local area energy planning. So rather than thinking about buildings or small groups of buildings in isolation, this approach of local area energy planning brings a whole systems approach across wide areas. And this could be for a city or indeed a whole region. And it involves joining up the physical requirements of the buildings, i.e. what needs to happen to buildings individually to reduce energy consumption, but then combines that with the energy generation and supply networks together with the policy changes, local needs and priorities, and the energy markets. So in Scotland, the National Lng Strategy I mentioned earlier is driving this approach where all local authorities in Scotland are required to develop what's called a local heat and energy efficiency strategy. And this is a 15 to 20 year plan to decarbonise all of the buildings in that local authority's area. We've been very fortunate as Arup to be working for the last few years with a number of partners, other consultants and the Scottish Government to develop the methods and the tools to create these strategies. We have great data sets in Scotland for homes, providing a range of information on glazing, wall and roof insulation, the fuel type and the many other data points on a house-by-house basis. And whilst the confidence levels in the data vary, there's no question, the data quality varies, but ultimately we have a very granular data set at national scale which we can use to support an analysis and visualization to understand the needs and opportunities for energy efficiency in homes to meet various priorities. Now the non-domestic data is still a challenge, there's no doubt, and it's time consuming to collect data from building owners and operators and to use benchmarks to fill the gaps in data. So there's still a lot to do to create data sets for the non-domestic building sector, but good progress is being made. So with these deep insights into the characteristics of buildings at that macro scale, so very granular data sets, but looking at them at large scale, we are then able to start overlaying other data about alternative sources of energy and to work out with the energy network operators, so the electricity grid, the gas grid and others, to then start combining plans for retrofitting homes and buildings with the network operators' plans for electrification and the introduction of alternative heating, such as the use of hydrogen. So we're really starting to see, and it's early days, but we are starting to see, the joining up of the planning, which has been fantastic. Last few slides now. So we've been applying similar approaches to cities in England with another large-scale city decarbonisation pilot project across cities, Newcastle, Leeds, Nottingham, Manchester, Birmingham, and Bristol. Again, we've been working with other consultants over a period of nearly 2 years now. In phase one, focusing on the decarbonisation project, so where large-scale ground source heat pumps may work, using big city green spaces, retrofitting existing buildings, developing and expanding heat networks, and also the potential for generating and deploying hydrogen into the heat network. And then phase two, we've looked at the development of the business cases. So how do you pay for and create opportunities for building retrofit across key sectors, housing, and particularly non-domestic public buildings, schools, universities, and hospitals. And we are starting to see the outcomes from this work informing government policy. They're thinking around funding models and green finance, the procurement and delivery structures. So, and again, in Scotland, we've seen this as well. We've done some work on national delivery mechanisms for retrofit in terms of setting standards and getting the supply chains in place. And this is also informing the whole approach to energy planning and indeed the energy market, so energy pricing. Very nearly there. So I've sort of hinted at this, the use of digital tools and big data are making a critically important difference in providing insights into building and energy baselines, and then the complexity of what needs to be done, both to develop integrated energy demand and energy network supply strategies, bringing those things together. And in this project, we're working with a local authority to develop an area-wide energy strategy, which sets out the pathway to meet a net zero target by 2050 for the local authority, whilst also accommodating the growth in that area. So lots of new housing and other growth anticipated. And we've adopted a whole systems modeling approach, which captures options for decarbonising electricity, heat, and in this case, transport as well, given the electrification of transport. And then we've developed the modelling methodology in collaboration with the client through various workshops, which then led to this workflow diagram, which we find these kind of diagrams, is, in a way, as simple as they are, but they kind of start helping to communicate the complexity and the approach of what we're doing. Let me go back one, let's see if this works. So my penultimate slide, it's just a very quick look at one of the digital tools we are developing to support city decarbonisation planning. And we use various tools. It's sort of a platform that brings together various tools. We can then include detailed building specific energy data that allows us to carry out analysis of different building typologies in the aggregate for the whole city or areas of the city. And we overlay this then with data on energy networks and other important information such as green spaces and water courses, which might support different forms of low carbon heat. So the sort of the digital planning tools are starting to make big inroads into. My final points, just to finish off. So data is absolutely key. The obvious thing to say for the day, I guess, but data on buildings, energy networks, and other energy sources, and the ability to bring those things together in sort of analytics platforms is so important. This concept of wide area decarbonisation and energy planning, so not building by building, but thinking of it, as a whole systems approach. The use of digital tools, giving us those wide area insights from the large data sets that we have or are creating. Scale is key, not just in terms of the approach and the planning, but also in terms of the major programs of retrofit projects that are needed. We need changes at national delivery scale around finance and how we do this stuff. And my final point really is about engagement. As an engineer and as consultants, we are starting to create the solutions, but we need to take people with us. Retrofitting homes particularly is a very, very personal thing. And whilst we might have the technical solutions, there is still so much to be done to bring people and communities on the journey to decarbonising buildings with us. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Andy, for sharing how local and regional planning and strategies can help contribute to a net zero built environment. We will now be moving on to the panel discussion. If you have any questions for the speakers and panelists, please type them out using the Q&A function. May I please introduce Mr. Simon, Director of Policy and Research at BC, who will moderate this panel. I'll now pass the time to you, Simon.
Thank you, Wayne. First of all, I would like to thank the three speakers, Phoebe, Luca, and Andy, for your presentation. That's very informative, very helpful, and setting the scene for the conversation that we're having now. Now, I think joining the three speakers, we also have two local experts. Sitting next to me, we have Ms. Ivy Lee, Managing Director of Lng Orange Limited. And then to my further left is Dr. Raymond Yao, General Manager of Swire Properties Limited. Well, welcome both of you to the event. Maybe Raymond, I would like to start with you. Now, Swire Property is a very important property developers in Hong Kong. You're also managing properties and facilities and premises. What's Swire Property's approach to reduce carbon in your portfolio? Do you have any plans specifically to transition to net zero buildings?
Simon, thank you for the questions. And it's good listening to so many international speakers on this very important subject. Swire Prop has over 23 million square foot investment portfolios, and primarily in Hong Kong, as well as in Chinese mainland, with a properties in Miami. But largely our investment portfolio at present, but we're planning to expand to trading portfolio as well. But within this investment portfolio, we set out a science-based target, long-term decarbonization target. And so day back in late 2019, we have submitted our SBT target to SBTi and got the approval. And subsequently in late 2020, we believe that we need to consider even committing ourselves even further, and therefore we joined the business ambition for 1.5 degree. And also a few months ago, we actually submitted the 1.5 SBT submission to the relevant parties. And less than roughly about 3 weeks ago, we received the approved 1.5 aligned SBT for the whole Swire Prop corporate, focusing on our investment portfolio. So what does it mean is offices, retail, and hotel. That's took up what I just said about 23 million square foot of gross floor area. So with this really tall order, what's the implication of that is we will have to increase our effort at least about almost 50% in terms of the absolute carbon reduction by the year 2030 compared to our previous commitment on the 2 degree aligned SBT. So it's not simple, straightforward and easy to go, but it's a lot of commitment. And therefore, with this new commitment, we actually rekindle our long-term strategy and focusing on a lot of innovation and experimentation. So with this new committed SBT, we call it near-term SBT, like what Lucas earlier mentioned, because it helps us to govern the journey in a near-term decarbonization up until 2030. But what does it mean afterward? Then definitely, we also, that's paved the way to achieving net zero by the year 2050. So we in short, we exercise energy efficient equipment or replacement on our existing stocks and continue to procure similar kinds of products in our new build in this investment portfolio. We perform high performance passive design and also commissioning and retro commissioning of all this building timely to achieve the energy efficiency operation. That is very, very important, particularly for existing buildings. And we invest in smart and digital technology. Later on, I might highlight some of the work we did in this area. And also we look for other kinds of opportunity to, for example, source funding to help us to do these kinds of green investment. But to say the least, is innovation is key, because committed to such a great sort of target, we need to constantly review what can add value and help us to do it, like what Andy Mays-Arab highlighted earlier. There's a lot of new ideas, innovations, but that's might be to look at a region or city level. But what does it mean to a corporate, despite the fact that we're reasonable size, but with our asset distributed in different locations? How could we achieve it? So we very much also need to not only rely on our own capability, but also we need to look for opportunity what the city or regional level could offer in terms of power supply. So also quite lately, we procure 100% renewable energy for 2 of our major assets in Chinese mainland, in a location in Chengdu, as well as much closer to Hong Kong, the Guangzhou. And luckily, we were able to procure 100% RE for these 2 major assets, helping us to really improve our overall decarbonization quite shortly. So we need to open up our mind and source all these kinds of opportunity, aside from doing ourselves. So we will have to look at a totally integrated solution. So, and maybe I'll stop here. This is a lot of consideration need to put in place in helping us committed to this really aggressive and ambitious journey.
Well, thank you, Raymond. But the sound of it is a huge challenge, and I mean, and a great commitment by Swire Properties. And I'm sure you have to work with others. You can't do it on your own. Yep. And later on, maybe I will come back to you, maybe trying to gather some more examples from you in terms of collaboration. But meanwhile, maybe I want to move on to Ivy. Now, Ivy, at Lng Orange, I think you made it very clear in your vision statement, and I think that's absolutely important, that the built environment actually as the most important field of action to achieve sustainable outcomes. Now, can you share with us some of the work that you've done in transforming the built environment, as well as maybe designing future net zero buildings, not just in Hong Kong, but maybe in other areas?
Thank you, Simon. First of all, really grateful to be here today, and also listen to the international speakers. Learn a lot. I echo, lots of the points, and I really want to talk about those points that have been brought up just by the speakers later. Just for the benefits of the international speakers, Lng Orange is actually an architectural practice found in Hong Kong, and we celebrate our 148th anniversary this year already. So we have a long history. We're very committed to, of course, sustainability. Otherwise, it won't bring us to this point. And we embrace innovations, and that is that spirit that actually give us that longevity, to grow with the city. So talking about, our commitment to carbon net zero, we, for a long time, the company already adopts a sustainable design framework for almost all our projects. And that benchmark with a lot of the green building assessment standards, BIM Plus, LEED, and China 3 stars. But with the transition into, we're talking about now we have to achieve carbon net zero before 2050, which is a tall order. So we have to, commit to a higher standard and the targets. So that's why currently we are bringing in more science-based approach into the company. We have to be really focusing on talking about how to reduce embodied carbon, which Phoebe has talked about. That is key for us as designer. First of all, how to vigorously reduce embodied carbon, especially in the building component, in the structure. That is a challenge indeed. That is a real challenge. And also how to use parametric design and all these computer simulations to help us to optimize the building performance, and also to use passive design to reduce the energy load and demand. So it's really a mindset shift in the company, and push the designers to think in a more scientific way. You know, we've been doing sustainable design for a long time, but now we're talking about carbon. We need to actually have a tangible, reduction in carbons. And throughout that process, we actually face a lot of challenges, which we actually also be very grateful that we work very closely with engineers, with other stakeholders to try to overcome all these challenges. In a way, at the moment, I echo with what I think Andy has mentioned, or even Luca, with sort of lack of a very transparent carbon data and all this benchmark or the carbon baseline. So for us as a designers, as a team, I think you agree the architects pretty much play a lead role in terms of the design of the building. And we really want to be able to feed the team to look at this scientifically and have a target to meet. And I think, in this process, we actually learn a lot. And the designers suddenly, realize that they must work with the engineers, must work with the whole supply chain in order to achieve carbon zero. And they listen to the engineers, which is great. And I want to share one last point is that during the design process, we find out that we do need the government to set, especially our local government, to set tangible targets, for carbon reduction, especially related to buildings and construction industry, so that we could actually, match against that. And so I may stop here for now. And yeah.
Well, thank you, Ivy. Now, that's all great points, and I can see our international speakers that you are nodding and with acknowledgement. Now, I don't want to turn this conversation into a Q&A session, so maybe I would like to ask our international speakers, after listening to Raymond's and Ivy's sharing, do you have anything to add? Do you want to make any comments before we move on to spend a bit of time talking about collaboration? So anyone, just raise your hand and, the floor is yours. Phoebe, you're smiling?
I'm absolutely smiling, but mostly in agreement. So nothing new to add on this particular topic.
Okay, Luca?
I think, you all said it perfectly, that collaboration is important to address the issue, because no one, there is so many issues that need to be solved, and the collaboration across the entire system is essential, because financial institution, property developer, architect, engineering, material provider, they all play an important role, but they all want to be part of the solution. But it's only through the collaboration that we can make sure that the pieces get together and we can really achieve the change. So this is very important. And data, I think, Andy said it, everybody said it, without data, we won't be able to make to understand where we are and where we need to go. 50% reduction of an undefined number, it's not a number. So we need to make sure that we have clear data where we are, and then we can add that to strategy. As Raymond mentioned, how do we what strategy can we apply? But then we have information that allows that for the trajectory to happen.
Okay, thank you, Luca. Andy, anything to add at this point?
Just very briefly, I completely agree with the partnerships. Collaboration partnerships are absolutely critical. My only other point, and I made it really at the end of when I was speaking, is just to reiterate that point of bringing people with us. We're all professionals here, but bringing communities, our people with us on this journey is absolutely key. And whilst the focus, I think, rightly you could say, has been on the science and the technical solutions, there is so much to do now about communicating that in simple, positive ways to society, to create the demand for the change, I think.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Now, I also saw a lot of questions actually coming from the audience. And actually, Lucas, you make an effort to answer some of those questions already by typing. So maybe now I will just leave the questions for now. I will make sure that we have a bit of time towards the end to address those questions. But Ivy, sorry for stopping you drinking, but I think we have to move on to talk about partnership.
Sure.
So, you know, you talk about mindset changing within the company, but how do you make sure that the change also, you know, go across the border and go into the community, and also maybe to inspire others? You mentioned engineers, you work well with them. Government, of course, is playing a very key role, and there are other players. Can you share a bit more in terms of how you work to them and work well with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to share with you a successful, I would say a successful example. I'm not talking about architecturally, but it's the process. We have a project called InnoCell in Hong Kong. The client is Hong Kong Science Technology Park. The mission of this project is a pilot project, is to investigate co-living, co-working concept in Hong Kong, as well as using modular integrated construction in a large scale, which is the first time in Hong Kong. And when we were engaged as a lead consultant, the whole process journey I really like to share with you is all about partnering. First of all, you have to, you know, in the end, have a project built, complete. People could see it, go into it, look at it, touch it, in order to prove the benefits of it. You know, a lot of it, you know, it's difficult to explain on paper. And we complete this project in a very short period of time. It's 2-3 years. And we start from a lot of engagement with the supply chain, you know, with vendors, contractors. We have very early discussion with statutory bodies to you know, let them buy into the innovative technology approach so that they understand it. We have engagement with a lot of public users, stakeholders, and in the end, we even have to go, you know, the extra mileage to talk to government about funding, because they have to understand innovations and net zero. All this, the investment in it is an investment. It's extra money, we need extra funding, but it's an investment, very important to us. So by, you know, engaging all of them in this whole process to let them see the benefits in it, I think this is absolutely important. It needs to have a lot of sharing. We have to keep everything transparent. We should not be doing like Andy said, one building. We're targeting in a bulk. We have to share with them to have that momentum coming through. So, I mean, that is my experience, my research experience, and I think it's the same for, you know, this target to achieve carbon net zero is absolutely, by all means, must be from finance all the way to a worker. You know, they have to embrace it. Yeah.
Thank you, Ivy. I think, and you're absolutely spot on. It's not easy task. It's easy to say, but actually to get it done is really challenging. Now, Raymond, with SWA, you've got a lot of experience, good experience as well, in terms of working with different parties, including tenants. I'm sure there are other, you know, stakeholders that you're working on. You know, just share with us some
I'd like to
highlights.
start with sharing with you on our engagement with the design consulting team.
Sure.
Just to cite the 1TP project, One Taikoo Place project, very successful high-rise sustainable buildings. Take back 2011 and the inception of the project. That's why actually, well, theoretically, engage a sustainability consultant officially first before getting the executive architect on board. I was told by the project director at SWA Property then, because he wants to ensure the team put together later on will be fully bought into this integrated sustainability process. And so he wished to get the best sustainability consultant on board to integrate all this together, and so on. So time passed by, it proved to be a very successful project, and lots of good, I would say, exemplary features as well as data are going to emerge from this project. We spent quite a while talking about embodied carbon. I do believe that could be regarded as one of the very first high-rise office tower with full embodied carbon database that we actually undertook with the help from the local university, UST in this case. So the magic number, Lucas, I saw your presentation earlier in your publication. This project, OTP, the embodied carbon is 575 kilogram carbon dioxide per construction floor area. So it's a magic number. And the building has used recycled steel for the outrigger structural frame as well as the rebar, and also low carbon concrete materials, leading to this super high rise only achieving or requiring or delivering only as little as 575 kilogram carbon dioxide. So we since the project, we use this spec as to form the basis for all our subsequent projects in Hong Kong as well as in Chinese mainland. Of course, the numbers will be slightly different and specification, but we share our technical publication in the public domain through conferences and also through the various occasions with details about how we put the numbers together, assumption on the emission factor for the concrete, for the cement, low carbon cement, everything. So basically, by looking at our paper, you can set out your own spreadsheet, be able to really compute the numbers together, because we want to share. We want the industry started to take up this kinds of approach in seriously taking on board on embodied carbon. Like what Ivy has said, it is so important. And also Lucas jumped into the embodied carbon content. And also Phoebe earlier said, is for the whole life cycle consideration is so important. So Swipe Property is used to sharing data and with the industry, engaging architects and also contractors, in this case, specifying it. But over to tenant. Tenants is key to us because we earned our rental income in letting out our retail as well as offices to tenants. So we need to engage them. We also want to share with them about our vision in decarbonisation. So the way I approach it is to, because we want to, this is an area which will be very sensitive. So we need to ensure it will be successful to begin with. So we selected some like-minded tenant to begin with, right? So without spending too much effort to convince them to join in, taking serious consideration. So over the past years or so, we started looking at those, for example, international tenants, which they do have their own sustainability policy. And then we start talking to them. And yes, I think it's easy to get buy-in, and then we then start some projects together. But now we begin to move out to study other SME or other tenants, learning from what we learned from those initial engagement, and then all will be benefit from this. So what we offer now is we offer free energy audit to our office tenants, whoever want us to be involved, to provide them some checking on the performances. We also offer, for example, green kitchen initiative to F&B tenants, particularly a few years ago, when there's a reducing numbers of visitors across from Chinese mainland. A lot of retails in Hong Kong are changing from high fashion center into F&B outlets, right? So suddenly surge of power. Then how can we keep on reducing it? Then F&B is a major power consumer. So therefore we come up with a green kitchen, good kitchen design guide. So now over about, it's a lot of uptake in Chinese mainland as well as in Hong Kong. So we positively provide some value, new ideas to our tenants to let them to share with those outcomes, eventually leading them to reducing carbon and also help the electricity bill. So this is the win-win in all kinds of situations. So we need to understand what they need and find a way to really approach them, but with sharing them with the right story to begin with. Okay, eventually we can achieve greatly on this area.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. Now, speaking about embodied carbon and tenants, actually, I have some questions relating to embodied carbon. Andy, there's a question for you. Does the plans for carbon budget linked to buildings include embodied carbon? So that's the first question to you. And Luca, I want to ask something about tenants. As how are we going to account for emissions produced by tenants in the baseline calculation? Do you have any suggestion? How should we do it, or should we just ignore it? Is it the best practice? Maybe Phoebe, in terms of engaging tenants, do you have any experience? So actually, this is a question for the three of you. Through your projects, through your work with your tenants, with your clients, do you have any such experience to share outside Hong Kong? So maybe Andy, you go first. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Simon. I did start to type the response and then I lost the conference, so I'm sorry about that. So the really simple answer is no. The energy planning work I spoke about is about sort of energy retrofit for energy efficiency to reduce consumption of energy. But the question is absolutely the right one, and there are other programs. So for me, the embodied emissions is more to do with the supply chain, and we need to make sure that work on the supply chain for building energy retrofit is done at the same time as the energy retrofit work, because if we're not careful, changes to buildings, the waste that is created, the embodied emissions in that, as well as the emissions in the new materials, new windows, everything that entails, we could offset the savings in operational energy by losses in embodied. So taking a circular approach to this whole problem is really important, and that's everything from extending the life of buildings, as well as setting up supply chains that are supplying insulation and recycling the waste, and all of those things that are needed. So it's an integrated cross supply chain issue to reduce total emissions, not just embodied. But the simple answer is, the work I spoke about is about operational, and the embodied is being considered in other programs of work.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Luca?
Yeah, I mean, tenant is obviously a big challenge because it depends where you are, what is your power of influencing the change. So,
okay.
But what we are considering at WBCSD, since, looking at the 200 members we have, they are global tenants, and they are a huge volume of space that they occupy. And so what we want to do is to create a global network for the real estate, corporate real estate, that share experience and provide solution for all these tenants on what can they do. And when you are one, it's more difficult to tackle the challenge. But when you also share experience together and look at what drive more demand, that's where hopefully there is an opportunity to drive change and share this common knowledge, common experience, and strategies. So really on how the company can address that.
Thank you, Luca. And Phoebe?
Thank you. So quite a lot of thoughts. Two categories. First, on tenant data. I think, as you know, the solution is not to ignore it. It is, there are methods for accounting for that through the greenhouse gas protocol. What we found with most of our clients is, yes, it's really difficult to obtain accurate tenant data. So what we do with them is divide up into a short and long-term approach. In the short term, in terms of doing your carbon model, what we encourage is try and access as much as you can, but then just use benchmarks and assumptions so that you can get some kind of baseline down. And then in the longer term, work with your tenants to be able to access that data. And that brings me then on to the tenancy engagement piece, which is that it's quite challenging to make sure that your tenants are giving you that data. And so what we're encouraging a lot of our clients to do is that in the transition to net zero carbon, there is going to have to be a lot of innovative cost sharing. And so one of the actions for that is to determine a kind of tenant engagement plan. So exactly as has been said, try and identify your priority tenants, ones who you think are like-minded, ones who have a large source of emissions, and work with them in a kind of exchange manner to say, well, look, if you give us this data, then we'll be able to help you with this particular action. And so try to make it an agreement that works for both of you. And that goes beyond data, which is that in the past, we used to see that green clauses and green leases were managed or were looked at with some skepticism, that they were never really going to work. But what's really interesting is in the past year, since net zero carbon has become such a big topic, we've seen so many people start to look back at these and start to come up with a really comprehensive tenant engagement plan and really revisit these green leases and green clauses to take advantage of the opportunities. So normally when lease events come up, to say, okay, this is the opportunity for us to work with the tenant to look at higher order energy efficiency, to look at assessing rooftop area for solar PV installation. So really trying to anticipate those lease events well in advance, so you're not a couple of months out and then by the time the lease is due to expire, it's too late to do anything substantial. So it's really coming up, forecasting what your tenant interaction is going to be like and engaging in the most positive manner. And around that really is that cost benefit sharing, so that you're overcoming that split incentive that always exists between the landlord and the tenant, and the landlord spending all the costs and the tenant perhaps reaping most of the benefits from that. So that's our main suggestion to most of the clients that we work with.
Okay, thank you, Phoebe. I checked the clock. Actually, we overran the event already now, but this is such an engaging conversation. So I'd like to ask for the patience of the audience, if you can spare an extra 5 minutes, because I still have a long list of important questions, but there are, a couple of things that I really want to ask our speakers before we close. Now, for Phoebe, Andy, and Luca, can you share some tips for our local audience in Hong Kong in terms of advancing to net zero buildings and in terms of collaboration? And for Ivy and Raymond in the room here with me, what would you like to say to your peers or your partners, business partners? What should be the next steps? How can you work closer together for accelerated action towards net zero buildings in Hong Kong? So maybe I will start with the international speakers. Very briefly, if you can keep it short. Andy, maybe I start with you.
Simon, yes, thanks. I think I touched on a number of points, hopefully in my presentation, around the need for that sort of connection from national policy and national drivers down through local authorities, etc. So I'm not going to dwell on that. One, and maybe this isn't about collaboration, but one big thing for me is the change for engineers, architects, and designers. We are moving really from careers around designing and building new to kind of fixing challenges that we have now, with the buildings that we have now. And that's a massive, massive shift for professional people who are joining and doing, setting out on careers because they want to design, new fantastic buildings. Now, of course, we'll do some of that, but so there's a big mind shift, I think, as part of that collaboration across the industry for people to see the value in careers that are working on existing buildings, not just working on all the shiny new stuff.
Sure. Well, thank you.
That's a really important key thing.
Yeah, that's a good point, Andy. That's a good point. Phoebe?
Yes, I think I would. I muted the wrong one.
Okay.
So back now. I would agree with everything that Andy said, which is that, for us, the main message is to think holistically about this issue, to think about the various players that you can collaborate with and really seek to initiate those relationships well in advance. So much of the success of achieving net zero carbon is about setting those longer and nearer term goals and then teeing yourself up for success on that journey. So, and this can go from anything from embodied carbon to carbon offsetting to energy efficiency interventions. It's about, yes, the target may be a few years away, but let's think about all the steps that are required to get there first and develop that strategic action plan so that you are actually targeting the most significant sources of carbon and using your limited funds as a company in the most efficient way possible.
Thank you, Phoebe. Well said. Luca?
Not much to add, I guess, but I mean, I think three main points. I think it's first is to measure the carbon emission, you know, like company emission, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and the building emission, the whole life carbon, as you mentioned. The second is to develop climate plans and set targets. So short term and long term, which is important, both of them. And the third is to act, you know, like it's to start. I mean, small, big, it's important to start before to kind of get it the right way. Let's start. And then starting with, as Phoebe just mentioned, you know, with the, maybe the most material one, but also the easy win. You know, sometimes it's good to have that quick win that brings you closer to the goal. So
yeah, the low-hanging fruits, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Raymond?
I think already through the network of Hong Kong Green Building Council, SWIPROP is participating or sponsoring the Advancing Net Zero competition.
Sure.
So the outcome from that competition could be shared with the wider industry, not only locally, but regionally, if applicable. So and second, it's Hong Kong Green Building Council is establishing some what we call the super low energy targets as interim measures, paving way achieving net zero ultimately. So that's helping us. That require developers and facility managements of building owners to start measure energy consumption, carbon accounting, and then identify ways to reduce it and so on. So GBC is already doing this, and I'm acting as a chair of the subcommittee overseeing this particular event. So those of experience are already sharing among the local communities here and reaching out to various developers in town and also designers and operators.
Okay, that's a great project, and BC actually is also a supporting organization.
Yes.
So thank you, Raymond, for bringing that up. Ivy.
I think it's really about total commitment, especially the commitment from the leaders. No matter you're a leader of a country, you're a leader of a government, you're a leader of a corporation, or you're even leader of a family, you have to step forward first and bring your team and then, you know, and collaborate. I think we have to see that sort of commitment now, because without the commitment of all these leaders to work together, it's very difficult to inspire the whole community. So I think that is important.
Thank you so much, Ivy. I think with that is a good remark to close the event. Now, please join me to thank all the speakers. Give it up to them one more time. Thank you. And I will now hand it over back to Wayne to close. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Simon, all speakers and panelists. This concludes the webinar. You will later receive an event feedback questionnaire, and please take a few moments to fill in the form. If you want to know more about future BEC events and updates, please follow our social media channels. Thank you again for joining us and have a nice day.
Thank you.